The time is 1986. Ronald Reagan was the President of the United States. We survived the Carter administration with its misery index, which followed the national disgrace of our leadership, allowing us to fail in Vietnam, and the subsequent ridicule of those who dedicate their lives to protecting us and our freedoms, our military. We survived gasoline rationing and the import of bad steel. Manufacturing moved overseas at an insane rate, and inflation reached double digits. There were no such things as cell phones, the World Wide Web, digital television, iPods, iPads, or other small entertainment devices. The cassette was still king, but the CD was just starting to come into vogue. VHS and Beta battled for dominance in the home video recording environment. You needed to take out a small loan to buy a video camera, and you needed a strong hand to hold it, or a good tripod and plenty of space. Computers were primarily used for business and were not yet popular for gaming. The IBM Personal Computer PC was the most popular for its business applications. The Apple Roman II was the king of the class. The graphics were primitive. The Commodore 64 was arguably the best gaming console ever. Video stores started popping up, but first you had to buy a membership before you could rent a video player or video cassette. If you lived in a rural area, you relied on a couple of over-the-air channels for your TV signal, along with a tall tower with an antenna on top, or you had a 6-foot or 8-foot analog dish for receiving more channels. You paid huge amounts of money for long-distance calls to call your friends and family. Sometimes a call of just a few miles would involve additional costs. Charles, everyone called him Chuck Newmeyer, sat in an unfamiliar bar and examined the contents of the glass. Sometimes he drank strange beer, but he couldn't remember the last time he was drunk. His intention was to start a new tradition that depended on drinking himself into oblivion on this special day. The amber liquid in the glass, bourbon, was a beautiful color, he decided. In fact, this particular shade of amber might become his new favorite color, replacing the red that his wife Marcy preferred, and, because she loved him, was his default favorite color. Chuck slowly turned the glass and raised it to the light, looking at distant objects through the glass. This was his 8th shot of bourbon since he stumbled upon this bar. Or the 9th, he didn't care anymore. He just wanted to not care about anything. He downed the glass and no longer winced from the burning sensation. It must be working, he thought, as he found it difficult to feel any physical pain. But when did the mental pain stop? The bartender poured him another at his gesture. Chuck sat and thought about this next drink, lost in memories. He was born just a few miles from his current location, in the only hospital in Crockett Villa. He grew up here and only left for a few years to get an associate's degree in construction before returning and taking a job with his old family friend, Billy Chase, who owned and operated Chase Construction. Over the years, Chuck has done almost everything from concrete work, to laying block and brick, to rough siding, and then to finishing work. During tough times, Billy began doing minor repairs, and Chuck was assigned to do window replacements, minor repairs, and even taught him some plumbing techniques to raise the necessary money to keep things going. They even built sheds, steel farm buildings, and grain silos as needed. It's not something they wanted to do on a regular basis, but in tough and lean times you do what you need to do. Chuck was now the project manager. This gave Billy time to go out and look for new clients. As a project manager, Chuck hired crews, assigned work, and scheduled subcontractors. Sometimes the situation got tense, and as a manager, he had to diffuse the situation. Sometimes talking helped, but sometimes it was necessary to bump a couple of guys' heads. Chuck was 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 186 pounds most days, but he grew up in the tough construction business, so he wasn't afraid of a confrontation when needed. Respect is everything in this business, so he had to be a little tougher than the toughest guy and couldn't tolerate bravado. He managed. This year, 1986, the construction industry was again on the verge of collapse. The works were small and rare. Everything was tight. Marcy Newmeyer was Chuck's anchor. A couple of years younger than Chuck, at 48 years old, she was a typical middle-aged woman. She was still his high school sweetheart, but her 5'4" body had gained a little extra weight, but Chuck never minded. They literally grew up together and went to the same schools until high school. They had been dating since 8th grade. The only disagreement in their budding relationship came a few weeks before prom his senior year. They went to prom together his junior year, and the whole town knew they were a couple meant to be together. Their school days were in the late 1950s, and once you choose your mate, you were expected to stay with that person. No one interfered in your relationship. Chuck gave Marcy his letter sweater when he was a junior and she was a freshman, and only borrowed it back to add new patches and pins for his letter, the capital C for Crocketville High School. When he bought his cool ring, he wore it for a week before giving it to Marcy. She immediately wrapped it in yarn and wore it proudly on her finger. Since she was a couple years younger, he didn't receive her ring until her sophomore year, when he was a senior himself. Her ring always hung on a chain around his neck. He didn't take it off even when he took a bath. Shortly before their prom, a snake slithered into their Garden of Eden. Chuck was one of the few guys in school at the time who had his own car. It was a big Oldsmobile that he bought for a couple $100s, which was quite a fortune at the time. He and his father tuned the engine so that it purred. It was a large engine capable of propelling this heavy steel machine to 80 miles per hour. Marcy was always proud to sit next to Chuck in the front seat. Many people made fun of them, saying that it takes two people to operate this big machine. It also had room for their friends and became a party car for trips to the river for swimming in the summer, to the river for skating in the winter, to baseball and softball games, dances, movies, sock nights, and whatever else came their way. Head. In fact, most people rarely saw one without the other at any time, except when Chuck was working on his uncle's farm a few miles outside of town. Chuck met Marcy in the school cafeteria for their usual mystery meat lunch. "Marcy, I know we've been together from the beginning, but I don't want you to think that I'm taking you for granted. Will you go to prom with me this year?" He smiled as they had been talking about prom, his senior prom, for a while now. They even discussed the possibility of getting a motel room and taking things to the next level. This was a huge decision for any couple because, for the girl, she had to remain virgin to her only lover. Marcy Baines looked up at her boyfriend and announced, "Sorry, Even, but you're a little late. Jimmy Willis asked me to his graduation, and I accepted. I know you love me and I love you, but I've never dated anyone else but you, and so I decided I needed to spread my wings a little." Everyone within earshot held their breath. They don't do that. You can't dump your boyfriend on the eve of high school's biggest social event. Everyone watched Chuck closely. Chuck was confused and afraid he was going to throw up. Getting hit in the stomach on the football field had never made him feel so bad so quickly. He also didn't realize how loud he was talking until his friends later related to him word for word his response to her statement. "Why are you doing this now? We were talking about it. We planned prom and all night, don't you remember? We're going to get married as soon as you graduate from school in a couple of years. I will wait for you as long as necessary." His expression made some of the guys feel uneasy, and most of the girls wanted to console him. Marcy must have anticipated his questions. "Well, first of all, we've never dated anyone else. I want to see what else there is in the world. You're going to graduate, and I'll still be here for 2 more years. Jimmy can keep me company while you're at school. I just decided to start dating now instead of waiting until you leave. Besides, Jimmy is the senior quarterback, and you're just a linebacker. He could be prom king, and I know you don't even want to run for it. I can be prom queen with him." Chuck was completely out of his element. His best friend, his girlfriend, his future wife, sat there in his sweater and his cool ring, acting like they were just acquaintances who hung out from time to time. They grew up together. He was told by both his parents and her parents to keep an eye on her. He took her to school when she first started walking, and she was so afraid that she held his hand all the way to school and back for days until she felt comfortable. They shared their first kisses with each other. They met, went to the meeting place, and hugged. There had never been anyone else, and Marcy had never said she wanted change until today in front of the entire school. He lowered his head in defeat. Any scene here would make him look like a weakling. He took a deep breath. I think you have a right. Since you are making such plans, I think you should return my sweater and my ring. At the same time, he took off the chain and threw it on the table in front of her. Wait a minute, I'm not breaking up with you. We're still together. We even have a date on Friday night. We're going to the movies with Sandy and Jeff. No, we're not going. Damn it, keep the sweater and the ring. I won't wear them anyway, because they are desecrated. He turned and walked out of the cafeteria, heading straight to his car. Even though it was forbidden, he jumped into it, praying that it would start as many of his classmates came out to see what he would do, started the engine, and, when it started, accelerated into the gravel parking lot and drove off in a cloud of dust. He went to the farm and started chopping wood for the stove his aunt and uncle were still using. He then let out his tears of frustration and anger. He couldn't let anyone know how badly he was hurt. He just hoped that Marcy would be unhappy at and leading up to graduation. His wishes came true. When he returned home that night, his mother told him that Marcy had called. He shrugged and went to his room. Later, his mother came to his door and asked what was going on. Mom, I'll be honest with you. I didn't know it, but Marcy decided to date Jimmy Willis and go to prom with him. She didn't tell me anything until lunch today. Since then, I have had no reason to talk to her. Of course, Beulah Newmeyer did not like this. While she could sympathize with her son, she knew Marcy was a good girl and meant to marry Chuck. She and Marcy's mother were best friends, and the families had been close since the children were little. She tried to get Chuck to at least talk to Marcy on the phone. Chuck flatly refused. The next day at school, Chuck felt even more alone. He was so used to Marcy sitting next to him in the car that he continued to look at the empty seat, leaving for school a little earlier than usual, so as not to see her traitorous face. At school, 3 different girls approached him and asked him to prom. These weren't even the less beautiful high school girls you'd expect to jump at the chance to get a prom date. No, it was all Marcy's cheerleaders and friends. He thanked them and said he would respond later in the day. One of his boyfriends then came up and patted him on the back, dragging him towards a small group of other classmates who were ready to beat up Jimmy Willis, even though he was their starting quarterback. Chuck convinced them to leave Jimmy alone. He realized that Marcy had made a decision, and Jimmy had simply taken advantage of her desire to expand her horizons a little earlier than he expected. He had already come to the conclusion weeks earlier that she would probably date while he was in college. Just before classes started, Marcy caught up with him. She was seething. "What's wrong with you, Chuck? Mom had to take me to school this morning. She reproached me all the way for leaving you. I'm not leaving you, fool. This is just one date, not a commitment. What makes you think I'm leaving you for Jimmy Willis?" She even grabbed him by the shirt and tried to hit him for some reason. She had to anticipate his facial expression and the strength of the block to prevent her hand from hitting him in the face. Now he was furious with her. What did you expect, arranging such a surprise a couple of weeks before graduation? Prom is, damn it, the dance of the year, according to you. This is my last graduation, as I will be going to college after this. You'll have 2 more chances to go to prom, and you can go with whoever you want. I will also remind you that we made plans not only for the dance, but also for later. We've discussed this and worked on it for years. Now you are going with Jimmy, and as far as I know, you will bless him with your favors after the dance. I know this won't happen to me. Regardless of whether you agree or not, when you told me you were going to prom, it ended our relationship right away. You left me. This also means that you will have to suffer any consequences of your action. I hope you don't get another date all year, including this summer. I'm also pleased to say that 3 girls have already asked me to their prom this morning. Maybe there will be more later, I don't know. He let go of her hand, which he was holding, so as not to be hit. I was raised to believe that hitting a woman is wrong. I was also raised not to allow a woman to hit me. Try to hit me again, and I might forget what I was taught. He turned away abruptly, and she was still sobbing. He hardened his heart, ducked into the classroom, and sat down with the rest of the gang, away from the rest of the girls, who had their eyes wide open and ears open to find out all the dirt. He saw Jimmy approach Marcy in the hallway and tell her that he wasn't going to take her to prom because every girl in his class told him what a creep he was. Chuck attended prom with one of the cheerleaders, Jenny. It was a pleasant experience, but not the one he wanted. Marcy was also present, but she had to ask her cousin to take her with him. No one wanted to sit next to them, and other girls even caught her in the restroom after the banquet and told her what they thought of her. Marcy didn't enjoy prom as much as Chuck did. Chuck stood his ground all summer after graduation, although Marcy continued to try to win him back. He leaned in enough to acknowledge her and didn't refuse to attend the joint events his parents insisted on. He just didn't ask her out anymore. That fall, after working on the farm all summer, he went to school 100 miles away. At that time, the roads were mostly gravel, making travel difficult. It took him half a day to get to the city where the school was located. He planned to return home only during the holidays. It was a 2-year college where he studied construction technology. While in school, he came home for Christmas break and then again for spring break. During summer break, he completed an internship with a large construction company, so he didn't return home until Memorial Day because it was a Friday, and he was given a 3-day weekend. On the 4th of July, he was home again for just one day to see the big public fireworks display. He drove all night to return to work the next day. He returned home again on Labor Day because it was a Monday that year. Every time he was home, Marcy tried to get him to talk to her. She was lonely because no guy asked her out, except for the cool assholes who thought she was a slutty woman. Her parents told the other girls not to have anything to do with her because she was spoiled. In reality, she still wasn't with a man and was innocent of all the troubles the rumors had brought to her door, but how could she prove otherwise? Chuck would be polite and say, "Hi," but that was it. He dated several girls in college, but didn't take any of them seriously. He might even have had his first sex, but Marcy still hurt him, and at the same time, he still loved her. That's why he didn't talk to her much. He knew she could still hurt. The next year was something of a repeat. Chuck had just returned home for the holidays. After graduation, he accepted a job offer from Chase Construction and started working. Marcy finally got over the gossip and ostracism. Jimmy Willis returned and invited her to her senior year. They dated regularly, but not as a committed couple. He genuinely liked her, so they continued dating, and he accompanied her to her prom, even though he had graduated from high school the year before. He didn't go to school because his father owned a local Chevrolet dealership, and he was guaranteed a job that didn't require a college degree. When Chuck returned to Crockett Village, he got a small apartment and didn't see Marcy often. He dated several different women, but everything was the same. There just wasn't the connection he had enjoyed with Marcy all these years. He knew he needed to move on, but he was in no hurry. After graduating from high school, Marcy decided to enroll in a local secretarial school. After completing all these courses, she decided to take an office management course. It took 2 years. During this time, Chuck would meet Marcy at a local grocery or department store. Now he could stand and talk to her for a while. At first, their conversation revolved around people they both knew who were still in town. Later, their conversations became more personal, with comments like, "Do you remember when we—" Marcy had plans that Chuck didn't realize for a while. She used these casual conversations to remind him of the good times they shared together as friends. If he started looking at those memories without rancor, maybe they could get back to what she wanted all along. She never wanted him to leave her, just for him to give her some freedom. However, she was incredibly jealous of any woman who even looked at him. This double standard came back into play years later. Now, as Chuck sat at the bar and thought about his past with Marcy, he could see how she carefully manipulated him into doing what she wanted. He didn't regret it because he wanted to be manipulated many times. He tossed in the next portion and motioned for another. When he was served, he again stared into the puddle of bourbon and continued to sort through his memories. He remembered how he finally asked her out again. They went to the cinema and then to a cafe to have coffee. They talked about the film and its symbolism. Then they laughed when they realized that their poor English teacher tried to get them to do the same thing with movies and books while they were in high school, but it didn't seem to make any sense. They had a great time. Chuck could almost believe that Marcy was still an immature schoolgirl when she hurt him. They made new plans to go outside. Soon they became a successful couple again. The year was 1960. The new decade was promising. World War II and Korea were merely plots for films that competed for hard-earned money among romantic comedies, westerns, and musicals. Most films were now shot in full color and with stereo sound. Very different from small black and white TV screens with a small speaker that was sometimes difficult to understand. As they grew closer as a couple, they began staying home more often. They made new friends and had card nights or played charades, and sometimes even a board game. Chuck eventually asked Marcy to marry him, and she immediately agreed. Their physical relationship also developed. There was no sex education in schools at that time. Sex was a serious subject and not something to be dealt with lightly. There was a magazine, but nothing else except comics to help with education. This topic was not discussed in polite society. Mothers told their daughters that it was their duty to submit to their husbands, and that sex before marriage made a girl a woman of easy virtue. Thus, the couple knew no more about sex than street gossip. The lucky one had an older person to teach and guide him or her, but most, like Marcy and Chuck, simply struggled to cope. Thus, they had virtually no education or experience that could help them in the bedroom. But preparing for their wedding was a different story. Chuck found a lot on the outskirts of town, and they designed a house they could afford. It was a simple ranch-style home with a basement. However, Chuck saw the basement as a potential living space rather than as storage space as was traditionally the case. He planned larger windows and higher ceilings. He also opted for a new thing called central air conditioning. When construction began, he participated in all its stages. He helped prepare the site and dig the basement. Forming the floor and foundations of the basement was his responsibility. Then the concrete was poured. After hardening, the blocks began to be laid. Chuck would come in the evening after a full day at other jobs to lay a row or two of blocks as his contribution to the house. He helped arrange the floor, then the walls. Every part of the house received something from him. He even helped lay pipes for bathtubs, sinks, and toilets. He completed the final decoration a few days before the wedding. The plan was for them to go on a short honeymoon, a week at a large resort in the mountains, before moving into their new home together. Chuck never asked Marcy what happened at her bachelorette party, but he was a little embarrassed. The construction workers got together and threw him a party. There was a huge amount of beer and adult films. The call went out, and everyone with an 8mm projector and black and white film brought it to the rented hall for the party. They set up a large screen, and Chuck was seated in a place of honor directly in front of it, slightly to the side of the projector. He was then exposed to a variety of short films of various sexual acts, ranging from 3 to 5 minutes in length. Chuck woke up this morning with a huge hangover. He was lying on the sofa in the living room. It seemed like most of the others were in the same condition. As they slowly tried to come back to life, everyone agreed that it had been one hell of a party. Chuck would admit only to himself that the education factor in the films was the most sexual education he had ever received. The films were too short to show any action that would really help. Their wedding took place with minor troubles. Extended families came from all over. Both mothers were delighted that the couple had overcome their early misstep and were now married. Their wedding night was the culmination of their courtship. In the newlyweds' room, they found a round bed, walls covered in red velour, pink champagne, and chocolate-covered strawberries. They both tried the offered treats and discussed the decor. Chuck took off his belt and untied his tie. Marcy wanted to quickly get rid of her dress and disappeared into the bathroom to change. When she returned, she was wearing a new nightie. She told Chuck it was a bridal shower gift from her mother and mother-in-law. It was a vision. In fact, she carefully hid and simultaneously showed off her body. Chuck knew her body in clothes, but this was something new and exciting. She was still the girl next door in appearance and build. Her breasts were full and her waist was thin. She had a wonderful smile, although a little hesitant, since she had never appeared in front of a man in such revealing clothing before. She was critical of herself and didn't see how good she was. She only saw things that she wanted to change. Chuck looked at the woman who outshone the prostitutes of the blue movies, and she was his woman. He approached her and kissed her. He said how much he loved her. She said she loved him more. They both smiled. They made their first love. Later, leaving the bathroom, she found herself under bright lights and realized that there wasn't much romance in the bridal suite that night. She turned off the light and soon fell asleep next to her new husband. The rest of the honeymoon was great except for the sex. Chuck didn't know how to be nice to his wife, and she didn't know how to tell him about it. There was not much communication between them on this topic. This set the tone for the years to come. These were exciting times. They married in 1961. Their daughter Rebecca, known as Becky to family and friends, was born in 1963. They survived the death of the president. Marcy cried all night the day he was killed and all day during his funeral. In 1965, the couple had a son. His name was John. He was a beautiful child who was loved by his mother and father, his grandparents, and his sister. Then came a day of absolute horror and grief. One morning, when John was 6 months old, he was found motionless in his crib. Marcy was destroyed. Chuck felt he had to be strong and not show how destroyed he was by his son's death. He was the rock that everyone could rely on. He was the one who had to try to explain to his 2-year-old daughter why her little brother was no longer in his crib. Doctors could not explain why John was taken. They called it death in the cradle. There was no other explanation. The doctors didn't want to talk about it. They seemed to hate admitting that they have no idea what happened. Marcy wondered if she was somehow to blame. Chuck thought that maybe she should have taken John to the doctor more often. Marcy wondered why Chuck didn't seem as concerned as she did. He even returned to work just a couple of days after the funeral, leaving her alone to take care of Becky. She returned to work within a couple of weeks. The family kept asking what happened. Nobody knew the answers. On the day of his death, the police responded to an emergency call. There was no 911 service back then. You just had to dial 0 and ask to be connected to emergency services. The cops seemed to think that Chuck and Marcy had done something wrong, but they couldn't prove anything. Even years later, whenever there was any contact with law enforcement, the officer would check something and suddenly cheated his attitude, becoming very aggressive. Chuck could now look back on that incident and see that something had changed then. Marcy wanted sex less. Hell, she never initiated sex between them, but after John died, she seemed to resist his attempts more often. It soon sounded like a heavy sigh as he tried to cuddle with her. They no longer touched each other lovingly. They still had parties and invited friends over as often as before. They had friends with children and would have nights out, barbecues, or card parties. Their small town escaped the worst of the race riots that paralyzed larger cities, but they had to change their thinking. Although they were not overtly prejudiced, they remembered telling Negro jokes and felt ashamed of it. Then came the disaster called Vietnam. Friends went there and died. Even those who survived were changed forever. People treated them terribly. We landed on the moon. Great moment in history. The space module burned down on the launch pad earlier. Another one almost never returned and did not complete his mission. At least 3 crew members returned home safe and sound. Russians and Americans met in space and shook hands. The president resigned in disgrace. Inflation was rampant and unemployment was also high. Free love was the slogan of the day for the younger generation. Chuck had a hard time understanding them. Illegal substances were now in the mainstream, although still illegal. A new method of birth control, the pill, appeared and immediately gained popularity. Women could now have sex with multiple partners without worrying about unplanned pregnancies. With the legalization of medical intervention, even unplanned pregnancies could be resolved. Chuck felt more and more disconnected from the modern world. Their daughter was now preparing for high school, and approaching puberty was a real possibility in the near future. He was always by her side. He attended her school events. She had been baptized in church and was now ready for confirmation classes. She was active in sports all year round. She was a beautiful girl on the verge of adolescence. Cosmopolitan magazine published a list of the best sex positions. Marcy read them all, but never discussed her desires with Chuck. She read best-selling books about sex, but never discussed her needs, desires, or dreams with her husband. Now there was an adult movie theater in the city center instead of one of the regular movie theaters, but good, decent people didn't frequent such places. There was even an adult store next to the cinema. Again, this was a place where you didn't find decent people. Marcy gained some weight during her pregnancy, but neither did Chuck, nor Marcy were particularly worried about it. Chuck still loved her with the same intensity he always had. In his eyes, she was still the girl he fell in love with. Chuck also gained a few pounds, but his job was very physical, so he stayed in good shape. Marcy was now a personal assistant, Pennsylvania, to her boss. This was a new position. Initially, it was just a secretarial job, but later it became very necessary in the business world. Both made good money. Chuck still earned the bulk of the income, but Marcy's contribution was significant. Their house was almost fully paid off and was due before Becky graduated from high school. They were saving money for her education, and they hoped that she would be able to get grants and scholarships because she wanted to become a doctor. They were proud of their daughter, and deep down, they still grieved for John. They did not fall for the trick of comparison with their neighbors. They resisted the urge to change houses every few years, as some of their contemporaries did. Their mortgage payments were low, which helped during years of high inflation. Their cars were paid for and continued to work well. Around the time Becky was supposed to graduate from high school, they bought a camper and went on trips every summer. Chuck and Marcy also avoided one of the pitfalls that many couples fall into. Most of their peers fell into two main groups. One group sought out extramarital pleasures, while the other stayed home, watched television, and slowly slipped into oblivion. They continued to go out to dinner and movies, to casual dances, and to visit other couples. They continued to discuss current events, their jobs, and their daughter and her activities. Chuck told Marcy every day that he loved her, every morning when they left for work, and every night before they went to sleep. Marcy repeated these words every time, without exception. Becky graduated with honors and soon attended a 4-year college to earn her bachelor's degree and worked at a nursing home to earn money. She was a wonderful young woman. She dated a few guys in school, but didn't seem ready for a serious relationship. Perhaps after medical school, her parents suggested. Chuck felt no pain as he completed his thoughts about his early years and his relationship with Marcy and his daughter. The year Becky graduated from high school, they quietly celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. They paid more attention to her achievements. Every year they celebrated their anniversary with dinner at a nice restaurant. Gifts for each other were thoughtful and lovingly chosen. Even though Chuck had his own secretary, he never allowed her to choose a gift for Marcy. It wasn't like Marcy's boss, who wanted Marcy to choose all the gifts he gave. Now Becky had graduated from college with a pre-med degree and was awaiting her placement letter. Since it was her parents' 25th anniversary, she planned a big celebration to celebrate the occasion. Many of their old friends had never reached 25 years of marriage, making this celebration even more necessary. They beat the odds. They still loved each other. Chuck paused in his thoughts and drank more. It was becoming very difficult for him. It was difficult to concentrate on recent events. It was these events that caused him the greatest pain. Not since John had died, even with the deaths of his parents in the intervening years, had he felt so alone or in such deep pain. Chuck suddenly needed to leave the bar. He felt stuffy. He needed fresh air before he threw up. He stumbled as he reached the door, almost falling. "No, not here," he screamed in his head. "I need to get out. I need to be alone. I can't break down here." He managed to open the heavy door. She didn't seem so heavy when he walked in. He staggered away from the bar and the parking lot light. There was darkness, blessed darkness. It matched the darkness in his soul. No matter how drunk he was, he couldn't stop thinking about the celebration. It was planned for their anniversary. Becky was very persistent about this. Since it fell on Saturday, it seemed like divine providence. All their friends and remaining family members were able to attend. The holiday began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and was supposed to last a couple of hours. Becky decided she could serve a light appetizer along with the big cake. There would also be beer and liquor for those who wanted to drink. After all, it was a celebration. Marcy started the day with a few drinks while still at home. She was in a real festive mood. By the beginning of the holiday, she was already drunk and walked around the hall, greeting people. There was her boss and his current wife, and Billy Chase and his wife, who was in a wheelchair. Many of Chuck and Marcy's co-workers and people from their church were there. It was nice to see so many people speaking highly of this couple. Becky brought old photo albums and laid out photos of the happy couple for everyone to see. There were photographs of herself, from infancy to adulthood. There were also several photos of John. Almost everyone knew about their loss. It was never kept a secret, so no questions were asked about the children's photographs. There was an open microphone for people to come up and talk about some of the funny and sometimes awkward moments in the happy couple's life. No one mentioned Chuck's graduation party. Even Becky had never heard of her mother's big mistake. As Chuck walked, or rather stumbled, along the poorly maintained sidewalk, he failed to notice that there were no buildings in the area. It was dark, and that comforted him. He fell several times, but got up each time. Alcohol was beginning to cloud his mind. What day is today? Is it Sunday already? Is this the end of his hell? Chuck continued to walk and remember. At the end of the chat, Marcy and Chuck were invited onto the stage. Chuck only said a few words. He thanked everyone for coming. He then thanked Becky for organizing the event. He then turned to Marcy. Marcy, you are the only love of my life. Without you, I am not a complete person. In fact, without you and Becky, I would be just a shell of a man. He raised a toast to everyone and drank the last glass of champagne. Marcy stood up. She was unsteady on her feet, but her words were easily picked up by the microphone. She stuttered a bit before whispering her remark. What nonsense! Talking so much crap about a man who thinks he's a great lover. Andy should be here instead. He knows how and what to do with me. She slowly sat back in her chair. The whole hall froze. Everyone who knew him looked at the man sitting at the end of the hall. Andy, actually Andrew Cornings, tried to look as inconspicuous as possible. One of the women sitting next to him stood up and hit him. You're a bastard, she said and walked away. Becky was on her way to her mother when she heard those terrible words come out of her mouth. She stopped at the edge of the stage and began to cry. Chuck was dumbfounded. At first, he completely ignored what he heard. There was no indication that Marcy was thinking about anyone else, let alone having a physical relationship. Chuck sat down at the table away from his wife. People blushed with shame, remembering that they suddenly had business elsewhere. Marcy's boss shook his head at his assistant. There will be a showdown on Monday. He looked at Mr. Cornings. Yes, there will be a showdown on Monday. Billy Chase walked up to Chuck. He said something, but it didn't reach Chuck. He was still trying to understand what had happened in his life. A few minutes ago, he was happy. Now he didn't know when he would be happy again. Billy gave in and took his wife out to their car. He'll talk to Chuck on Monday. Becky finally pulled herself together, blew her nose, and went to her mother, who was now in a state of oblivion. Marcy rarely drank, and she had to pay for today in many ways. Becky looked at her father. He sat in a fog, but seemed to be physically okay. She asked some of her cousins for help, and they picked up their aunt and carried her to the car. The look on their faces made Becky think they wished they had put her under the car instead of inside. All relatives believed that Chuck was a great guy and did not deserve such humiliation. The rest of the family helped clean up the remains of the party and tried to give Chuck space. They noticed him get up and go to the toilet, but did not see him leave through the emergency exit next to the toilet. Chuck got into his car and drove to the nearest diner. Chuck, with tears in his eyes, continued to stumble along the unfamiliar sidewalk. He kept replaying in his head Marcy's confession and her preference for her lover over her husband. Chuck always considered himself a good man, a good father, a good husband, and perhaps an adequate lover. Without sex education, how could he think otherwise? Without feedback from his only lover, his wife, how could he improve or change? Was he that bad? If yes, then what about being a normal person, a father, a loving husband? Damn, what is the meaning of his life then? He fell again and did not get up for a long time. He didn't know where he was and frankly didn't care. He finally sat up as the headlights illuminated him. It was a city policeman on patrol. He stopped and asked Chuck if he needed help. Chuck didn't answer. Backup was called and several more officers arrived within minutes. The first officer began to examine Chuck. He smelled like old alcohol. His clothes were of good quality, but dirty and torn from falls. There were abrasions on his face and arms from falling and trying to get up. Additional officers secured the scene and searched for the cause of the victim's appearance. Chuck wasn't very good at answering questions. He was confused. His head felt like cotton wool. He couldn't concentrate on the policemen, and they all kept asking questions, not giving him time to formulate an answer. The city didn't have an ordinance against public drunkenness, and the jail no longer had a drunk cell, so officers had limited options. They found Chuck's driver's license after a brief struggle to get to his pocket containing his wallet. He was at least 2 miles from his home address, if it was correct. They asked dispatch to call his home address, but no one answered. What they and then Chuck didn't know was that Becky took her mother home and put her to bed and then went looking for Chuck. Marcy was too drunk to answer the phone, so the call went unanswered. Since no one answered at the home address, the police had no choice but to call an ambulance. The ambulance arrived at the scene within 5 minutes. Tired paramedics weren't impressed by yet another drunk on their shift. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and they had only slept an hour between calls. They quickly picked Chuck up and loaded him into the back of the car. Chuck kept saying that his wife didn't love him. When asked about the pain, he simply muttered about his broken heart. When asked about the abrasions, he looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time and then shrugged. They might get sick later, but his depression was a bigger problem. They went to the hospital where Chuck was born 50 years ago. On the way, the medic asked Chuck again what happened to make him so far from his home. When he named the bar where he was, the medic was surprised, since Chuck was found almost a mile from the bar and far from his home. On the way to the hospital, Chuck asked the young doctor if he was married. The doctor answered yes. Chuck asked if his wife loved him. The doctor answered in the affirmative, since they had several small children. Chuck started laughing. "That doesn't mean she loves you. I also have 2 children, and my wife doesn't love me enough to be satisfied with sex with me." The doctor was shocked by this statement. He clearly didn't understand. Chuck went on to explain that his wife never loved him enough to be comfortable in bed with him. He repeated this all the way to the hospital. At the hospital, doctors escorted Chuck to the emergency room and laid him on a bed. He closed his eyes because of the bright light. He wanted darkness again. He heard one of the doctors trying to explain what had happened. It was close enough to the truth that Chuck didn't feel the need to explain again. He tried to sleep, but soon the nurse began taking his pulse and blood pressure and then spoke to the doctor. The doctor asked him about the events that had happened, and he repeated his story again, but this time he began to cry. He didn't know if he was sober, but he couldn't explain better that his wife didn't love him. The nurse cleaned his abrasions and applied bandages. She said they tried to contact his family, but no one responded. Chuck simply nodded. More proof that Marcy doesn't love him. She's probably with that bastard Andy, what's his name right now. He couldn't remember the bastard's last name. They then dimmed the lights and left the room. Chuck fell asleep for a while. He woke up when he felt movement in the room. It was still dark, but he could see the silhouette of the nurse who came to check on him. His head was a little clearer, but it hurt. After the nurse left the room, he sat down. He needed to leave. If Becky was worried, she would check out the hospital at some point. He didn't want to see anyone he knew for a while. He was too humiliated to even look his daughter in the eyes. He certainly didn't want to see Marcy. All the feelings he felt when she dumped him before prom came back. She wanted someone else, but didn't want to let him go. Well, she can take her boyfriend. He couldn't be older than 30. He was better suited to Becky's age. Young and tanned. His hair was bleached like a surfer's, even though it was hundreds of miles from any ocean. Chuck looked out the door. There was no one in the corridor, so he quickly headed towards the exit and soon found himself on the street. It was still dark, but there was light in the east. The sun would soon rise, and the darkness he craved would be banished for a few hours. He needed to find darkness and curl up and die for a while. Chuck walked down the sidewalk towards the street, and luckily a taxi he hailed passed by. He didn't know the address of the bar where he left the car, but he remembered the name, and the taxi driver knew it well. 15 minutes later, he was standing next to his car in the parking lot of a closed bar. As he was about to get into the car, he saw a familiar car driving past on the street. Because the parking lights were off, Becky couldn't see her father or his car. Chuck waited until she had driven past before opening the door and driving away. He soon left the city. The capital was only 2 hours away, and he could get there and hide for a while. He needed more alcohol and a place to stay. Soon the sun was fully up, but he was on the outskirts of the city. He found a motel next to the bar and parked. He wasn't completely sober, but he was too sober for what he wanted. Nearby, there was a store selling alcohol. He didn't even have to talk to people. He could just grab a bottle of his new favorite color and stay inside in the dark. He did just that. He bought enough and paid in cash so he wouldn't be bothered for a week. He drank, fell, vomited, woke up, drank, fell, vomited, woke up, and repeated this until the alcohol ran out, and he had no strength to go to the store again. He was still wearing the same clothes he wore to the party. He smelled terrible, even to himself. Vomit was everywhere in the room. On the walls, the bed, the floor, the shower floor, and the curtain, everywhere it seemed except the toilet. God, it smelled so bad that his stomach kept churning. He got up from the floor on the last day and got into the shower. He slowly straightened up and began to take off his clothes as the water flowed. He had no plan for the future other than to return to work. The only thought about his wife was connected with evil plans to make her suffer the way she made him. Right now, he doesn't know how to take revenge. She got her lover. Hell, he's probably lying in her bed right now. After all, she doesn't need Chuck anymore. She made that clear on their silver anniversary. He needed a place to stay. He certainly had no intention of returning to the house he had built for her while she lived there. Maybe she'll move in with Andrew, the god of love. No, she's not that attentive. With the house paid for in full, she would be able to handle the cost of her salary, and he actually built it for her. No, she will believe that she deserves the house and everything in it. Hell, she might not even give him his own clothes. She can keep them out of harm's way. After all, he is a complete loser in and out of bed. After taking off his clothes and trying to wash them with a small bar of soap, he rinsed them off and stepped out of the shower. He hung things up to dry and tried to clean up some of the vomit. He threw the bottles, no longer containing his new favorite color, into or near the trash since it was full. He opened the windows to let in fresh air. He reminded himself to tip the cleaners when they came to clean, as it would be a terrible job. A few hours later, his underwear, pants, and shirt were dry enough to wear. He went out and found a cafe where he ate and a cheap clothing store where he bought new clothes. He was surprised when he returned to his room and found that the staff had already left. When he checked, he saw that they had also brought a new mattress. Their tips were growing by the minute. He checked his money and found that he had a couple $100 left in cash, as well as a credit card that he rarely used. He'll probably have to use it to pay this bill. Since he was already on his feet, he called his boss at home. Billy was glad to hear him and didn't seem too upset that Chuck missed a week of work. "Listen, son, I kind of understand what you're going through. Before you came to work for me, Millie had an affair. She was damn attractive back then, and she knew it. It was hard for me with her, but she finally came to her senses when I got drunk and disappeared for a whole month. She was so afraid that I might do something to myself that she finally realized what a fool she was. She finally got back to normal, and we've been pretty good ever since. He made a pause. Have you called home yet? Chuck was frank. Right now, I don't have a home. If you mean did I call Marcy, then no. I have no reason to talk to her. Billy didn't try to convince him. Please call Becky. She calls every day to see if you are back. She's panicking. And by the way, so does Marcy. She also called me and Millie, crying because she didn't want to hurt you. Chuck finally sobered up enough to snort with disdain. Yes, I'm sure she didn't mean to offend me. Just like the last time she decided to go outside and do what she wanted. Sometimes it takes a while to learn a lesson, but I learned it. They talked about work. Chuck promised to return on Monday. Billy told him to take his time. He had accrued vacation days. Chuck thought he was going to use his vacation to take Marcy on a cruise. Luckily, he hasn't contacted an agent yet and booked it. Listen, Billy, this is costing me a lot of money, so I'm going to let you go. If you hear from Becky, tell her I'm fine. I'll try to call her before that and tell her myself. Bye. He hung up and then dialed Becky's apartment number. She didn't answer, but she had an answering machine, so he left a message saying he was fine and would be back in town in a few days. He will call her later. He didn't call home because he had no reason to talk to his wife. This was a problem that needed to be solved soon. Since she had broken their marriage vows, he no longer felt obligated to honor them. One of his thoughts during his drunken days was that he needed sex lessons. He thought for a long time in his alcohol-clouded mind about how to learn these lessons. Finally, he decided that he needed a woman of easy virtue who would be his sex teacher. Now, in the cold light of day, he pondered the question again. Oddly enough, it still seemed reasonable. Who else knows more about sex than a woman of easy virtue? He didn't know where to look for one in this city. He had heard about some street corners in the center of the capital where women of easy virtue stood. If he could find someone who wasn't sick or addicted to illegal substances, she could become his teacher. He went into the office and paid for a few more days of accommodation. He also apologized to the manager for the state he left the room in and gave a tip to give to the staff. This improved the manager's attitude a little. This was not a chain motel, but a family business, and they were struggling with the reputation of being a flophouse. A drunk who vomits all over the place didn't help, but an apology did. Chuck drove to the city center. He went out and started looking at the shop windows. Formally, he looked at store windows, but in reality, he was looking for women of easy virtue. He wandered for several hours. Since it was daytime, there might not have been many of them. After lunch at the diner, he continued his search. Finally, on one of the corners, away from the main business district, next to a more run-down mix of small apartment buildings, a few apartment buildings and small businesses, he saw several women standing on the corner, waiting. They weren't dressed like in movies and TV, where they wear tight clothes that barely cover the necessary parts. No, these women of all ages were dressed like ordinary people. The only clue that these were women of easy virtue was the way they stood on the corner and talked to passing drivers and passers-by. Chuck watched the women for a few minutes before approaching. One of the girls turned to his 50-year-old face with graying hair. She apparently wasn't too repulsive because she spoke right away. "Hello, sailor, how is the weather?" He smiled at her. She was one of the older women. Her face looked a little stern, as if her life was not easy. It must have been so, since she was here during the day, competing with the young ones. She had no darkness to hide her age. "You know, the weather is pretty good for this time of year. She could have been much warmer." "So, sailor, why are you in the city?" "Well, I'm actually looking for a teacher." Now, all the women on the corner were looking at Chuck. The first woman continued the conversation. "Teachers, you say? What kind of teacher are you looking for?" She gestured to everyone standing there. "I don't know of any of us being teachers." Chuck lowered his head in embarrassment. He decided that the truth was the best way. A week ago, my wife announced to me and everyone present that I was a loser in bed and could not satisfy a woman. I thought about it and decided I needed lessons. To do this, I need a professional who can take the time to guide and teach. She laughed along with the other women. I assume she gave you permission to do this training so she could benefit later. Chuck shook his head. No, in fact, she announced that, as she told me and her family and friends, she had already replaced me in bed. No, I want to do this for myself and for any future partner. So, are any of you interested in taking on this job? The women gathered together and began to whisper. Finally, one of the young girls asked a question. Where will these lessons be, as you call them? Chuck replied that he had a car in the downtown parking lot, and they would go to his motel, calling it. They conferred again. Finally, one of the other women spoke. Listen, trickster, you seem honest, but let's be realistic. It happened more than once that one of us got into the car and did not return. It's not right to end up on the shore of a lake or to be found in a landfill, even if we are women of easy virtue. The first woman who approached Chuck also spoke out. We don't have much, dear, but we have our lives, and we don't want to lose this last one. Chuck thought about it. He could understand their reluctance. Do you have a boss? They shook their heads. No, and we don't want him. One of the girls showed Chuck that she had a small pistol, and the other pulled out a switchblade. It's to keep them away. We don't try to work on popular corners, and they don't bother us. It's not beneficial for them. We pool our money. Someday we will get out of this business. The eldest introduced herself as Sylvia. She was at least 50 years old, with dyed hair and fake nails. The youngest was Tiffany with dark hair and small breasts. The other two introduced themselves as Mandy and Grace. They were about 30 years old. Chuck returned to the original question. Are you ready to help me, or should I look elsewhere? They conferred again. Then Sylvia spoke again. I will take on the role of the main teacher, and Tiffany will be the student. Mandy and Grace will provide security both inside and outside the motel. They discussed fees and came up with a figure of $1,000 per night. Chuck added cash to his mental list. The meeting time was agreed upon, and Chuck went to his car. Since it was Saturday, he needed to find his bank branch quickly. Luckily, he found one on the way to his car. He went inside and asked for cash. While he was there, he opened a new savings and checking account and transferred most of their money from the old accounts to the new ones. He was afraid that young Casanov, Mr. Andrew Cornings, contracted Marcy to give him money. Chuck left her enough to pay the current and next month's bills. Her salary had to cover the bills after that. The next stop was a pharmacy. He then ate a light but nutritious lunch. At the appointed time, there was a knock on the motel door. Chuck opened it and greeted the four women. Grace went back outside after she was sure there was no one else in the room. She had to watch from their car, parked across the lot from the room. She had a gun. Mandy took a chair by the table and pulled out a switchblade. She opened and closed it several times to remind Chuck that they took their safety seriously. Chuck bought a couple bottles of cheap wine and used plastic cups from the room to pour everyone a drink. He didn't know how to start and said so. Listen, girls, I will be honest with you about everything. I have never seduced a woman. In fact, I've only had sex with one woman in my life. We had just celebrated our silver anniversary when she told me what a bad lover I was. I don't even know how to invite someone to dinner. Sylvia took the lead. We won't fix it now. I think we should focus on how to excite a woman and then move on from there. Let's start with you and Tiffany on the couch. Chuck and Tiffany moved to the sofa and sat down. Tiffany, used to sex, looked relaxed, while Chuck seemed ready to jump out of his skin if someone said boo. Sylvia told them what to do. They worked on it for a while. Tiffany even looked pleased when they separated. Sylvia explained it best. Chuck, everyone hopes that their partner is so excited beforehand that he or she is ready to enjoy the first touch. This rarely happens. Look at us. We stand on the corner all day. We think about sex. Clients just want to satisfy themselves. We do whatever we have to, thinking about shopping, our last good sex, our kids, our grandparents, everything to not think about what's going on because it's humiliating and it just pays the bills. If any of these guys were good in bed, we might not have a job. Their wives or mistresses wouldn't let them out of their sight if they knew what to do with their bodies. Tiffany added this. Chuck lowered his head. It sounded exactly like him. He nodded in agreement. Sylvia raised his head. You and I are products of our generation. There was no sex education, no easily accessible magazines, no proper protection. We can be forgiven for our ignorance. This young generation can get an education in school. They can buy all the protection products without embarrassment. They have pills for almost 100% protection, but they still don't know how to love. She looked into his eyes. We can all learn. Chuck lowered his head. It sounded like him. He nodded in agreement. They taught him many subtleties and tricks of sex. After that, they all sat on the floor, drank wine, and talked. Chuck felt closer to these women than he had ever felt to Marcy. He realized that true love and intimacy is not just sex. This is understanding and respect for each other. After that, they all went to have breakfast together. The women discussed the events of the last 24 hours and came to the conclusion that they should become sex therapists. Chuck could only nod and smile at their serious discussions about lifestyle changes. After that, he said goodbye to them and went to check out of the motel. The cleaning lady smiled at him. He didn't know if the smile was because of the tip he left for the staff or because the room was relatively clean. He made one last long-distance call from his number to Becky. This time she was at home. Dad, when will you come home? Mom is very worried about you. She doesn't remember what happened on the anniversary, but many people explained to her what she said. She loves you and wants you to come back. Chuck snorted into the phone. Yes, of course. As for going home, I'm leaving here now and will be in town in a couple of hours. But I'm not going back to the house. This is your mother's house, not mine anymore. I believe she was telling the truth at the party and meant every offensive word. That's what alcohol can do, tell the truth. I'm also sure Andy has come to console her at least once in the last week. Becky was angry with her father. Dad, she says she never cheated on you and that it was all a mistake. Mr. Corning's just a personal trainer at the new gym my mom joined last month to get in shape. She just didn't tell you about the gym and the membership. Well, a lot is becoming clear now. By the way, if he's the personal trainer she met last month, why was he at our party? I don't think he would have been able to impress a woman that much in such a short time, and he wouldn't even bother going to a party where she only knew one person. No, I believe she saw him more than for personal training. She was right when she said I was a loser in bed. I think she was looking for someone who wouldn't be a loser and found him. Before she could respond, he told her he had to go and that the long-distance bill would be huge. She was still trying to say something when he hung up. He was right. The motel charged a lot for long-distance calls from the room. He paid and left. He had Sylvia's home phone number in his wallet. When he receives a new phone number, he can call her and arrange to continue his studies. On the way, he wondered where he should live in the near future, starting from that night. Since it was Sunday, no real estate agency was open so he could find a place to rent. Tomorrow promised to be a full day, as he would need to catch up on work from the past week. He really didn't want to stay at the motel for a few more days. It wasn't bad, but it seemed a little awkward to live like this now. Suddenly, he had an idea. They bought a motorhome that was self-contained. He could take it out of storage and move it to a campsite or trailer park and hook it up to utilities. He wondered if the campgrounds had electricity he could connect to. In the end, he decided that a trailer park would be better since it would definitely have electricity, water, and sewer, as well as a telephone line. After he picked up the motorhome, he discovered he couldn't rent a spot at the trailer park on Sunday, so he drove to a local campground and parked for the night. He took a taxi back to the storage area to pick up his car. After buying groceries, he returned for the night. The mattress was good, and he had a good night's sleep. In the morning he woke up, took a shower, shaved, and put on regular clothes to go to work. His plan was to start the workday and then try to stop by the house and pick up some things while Marcy was at work. He also had other personal matters to attend to, but for now he needed to get back to work at Chase Construction. When he arrived, Billy called him into the office. "Well, son, it was a very unusual party that we all attended. Although I have been through something similar, I have never faced this in front of family and friends. I will tell you that Marcy seems very upset. She calls every day, trying to find out if I have heard from you. Of course, all last week I honestly said that I don't know where you are. You scared me too, my boy. I think of you as a son, and to see you so knocked out, it was unsettling. Where did you go?" "Billy, I was really knocked out. That first night I got crazy drunk and walked away. I ended up in the emergency room when the cops and firemen couldn't help me. I sobered up and went to the Capitol." Chuck then explained the past week of drinking and even admitted how bad he was living, vomiting and all. He didn't tell his boss how he spent the weekend after he got sober. It was his business and his alone. Billy completely understood. He said that when his wife did the same thing to him, he remained drunk for a month. After being arrested for vagrancy, he finally sobered up. Police then contacted his wife to see if she could post bail. She did so immediately and then took him away. She then took him away for a week to show him how much she had hurt him. It took a long time before he finally forgave her, and he believed that she still hadn't forgiven herself. Her need for a wheelchair and physical assistance kept her from feeling fully forgiven for her sins. "I understand, Billy, but you are describing a situation where you found out about the affair and simply disappeared. The rest of your family and friends were not humiliated by this on one of the most anticipated anniversaries of any relationship. I see no forgiveness for her sin in the timing of the announcement. It was almost worse than the betrayal of our wedding vows. In fact, I personally think her embarrassment has more to do with the announcement than the betrayal itself. I think she believes that she deserves her lover, and that I should just stand there, or, better yet, turn a blind eye to her actions. No, it won't be like that. Now I need to get back to work, if you don't mind. It's all I have left, and I intend to throw myself into it. It's either work or drink, and I can't drink all day, every day to try to forget what she did to me." Billy patted him on the back and nodded in agreement. "I understand. You have to do what's right for you. I'm just sorry your family will never be together again after this." Chuck allowed himself one more comment. "I'm starting to come to the conclusion that my family hasn't been together in over 20 years. We stopped communicating on the level we needed to after our son died. I think it just took so long to finally end things. I'm sorry that this will affect my relationship with my daughter, but I will do everything I can to minimize the damage." He turned to the door. "After I check out the cruise, I need a little time to find a lawyer and also pick up some things. I don't have a phone right now, so it might be hard to find me." Billy snapped his fingers. "You know, I might have what we need to keep in touch with you. I rented some pagers a few weeks ago." He went and rummaged through several small boxes. "Here they are. Wear this one, and when I need to contact you, I'll call the number and leave a voicemail. Then you go to the phone and call me back. Here's the number for the one I'll wear. You do the same. If you can't reach me by phone." He gave the piece of paper to Chuck, and Chuck put it in his wallet. He spent some time catching up on paperwork, but then informed his secretary that he was leaving for a while. He headed to a nearby work site to check on the cruise. When he arrived at the site, he found everyone sitting idle. When he asked what was going on, one of his oldest crew members, and perhaps the grumpiest, Butch, answered. "Well, boss, we heard that you were going back to work today, and we decided to see if a weakling like you would dare show up. After all, you can't keep your woman happy at home, so you must not be a man, and we will not all work for weaklings." Chuck's eyes narrowed. "Well, this is something new, so you all think I'm a weakling and not a man." A couple of people nodded, but most turned away. They had all worked for him for many years, with a few exceptions. Butch always challenged his leadership, but backed down when pushed. Chuck expected him to back down again, but Butch didn't seem inclined to do so. In fact, boss, I appointed myself as a foreman in this area. The men won't work unless I tell them. Well, Mr. Foreman, how do you propose to continue working here? If I tell you that you are fired, and all of you, if you do not return to work immediately, what will happen? I don't have to take orders from a weakling, Chucky. When I decide, we'll work, and not necessarily when you want it. Chuck moved closer to Butch. Now, Butch, we've always had our little differences, but we've always found a solution. I'd hate to see you in the unemployment line during these uncertain times. Are you sure you want to keep this up? I only work when I respect my boss. After what we heard from your wife about your abilities in bed, we don't respect a man who can't keep his woman under control. Chuck was already very close to Butch. So, what will get your respect back? Do I need to show you that I can satisfy a woman? Butch leaned back and laughed. I don't think anything can bring back my respect. You've proven that you're not the man who can force me to do anything. Looks like I have no other choice. You're fired. Get out now before I call security to drag your ass off the premises. Butch laughed and reached out to Chuck at the same time. Why don't you drag my ass out of the lot yourself? Chuck knew this would happen. That's why he came so close. Chuck beat him. Chuck looked at the others. When he comes to his senses, tell him that if he apologizes, he will be reinstated. Otherwise, I can do this every day until he understands. He turned to the rest of the brigade. Did anyone misunderstand the message? Every person in the precinct nodded. Then get to work, or I will fire you all. Play with me, and I will repeat this message. Understood? Everyone cowered and went back to work. They moved slowly at first, but when they looked back, Chuck was still standing in the same place, watching carefully. The work immediately accelerated. Chuck looked at Butch and decided to call an ambulance for the man. He needed to check on it later. Butch was a good man, just a talker. Chuck visited other sites, but only had to threaten dismissal a couple of times before work returned to normal. It was just part of the job. Now he headed towards his old home. He needed clothes and toiletries. As he approached the house, he noticed that the lawn needed tending. He shrugged. It's not his problem now. Marcy's car wasn't there, so he didn't have to deal with her and her lies right now. It would have to wait. He opened the front door, not the garage door. It seemed a little strange after all the years of entering the house through the garage. The house was in disarray. Marcy usually kept everything clean, but now the house looked like it had come out of a hurricane. There were piles of dishes on the kitchen tables. Dirty pots cluttered the stove. Papers and clothes were scattered all over the floor. When he got to the bedroom, he found the same mess. Clothes were scattered all over the floor and bed. Chuck didn't check to see if there was evidence of Marcy's infidelity in their bed, as he assumed she had already brought her lover into the house, so he could continue to give her the pleasure she felt she deserved. When he walked to his closet, he found his clothes hanging neatly on hangers. He grabbed a suitcase from the basement and quickly filled it with enough clothes to last him for a while. He also included his favorite razor, shampoo, and soap. Toothbrush and toothpaste joined the rest. He carried the full suitcase to the car. Then he returned to the basement. This was his kingdom. It was as neat as if he had left only yesterday and not a week ago. He searched his gun cabinet and moved all his guns and ammunition into the car. There were tools in the garage, but he didn't need much in the camper. He grabbed a small toolbox with basic needs for quick repairs. Later, he may decide to buy a house, and then he will need more tools. He thought about throwing away everything he couldn't take today so that Mr. Cornings couldn't use them, but hated waste, so he left them. He went back and checked to see if there was anything left that he needed in the near future. Finding nothing, he took off his wedding ring and placed it on the chest of drawers in the bedroom. He put it in the change bowl. There were still small coins there from the last time he emptied his pockets before going to bed. His ring didn't look so lonely among the pennies and nickels. He locked the door and headed towards the campsite. On the way, he was thinking about how to find the gym where Andy works cornings. Andy needed a lesson about the consequences of sleeping with married women. He also needed to find a more permanent home for the RV, so he stopped at a convenience store and sat down with the phone book. Looking for trailer parks, he found a few to call, and then found several gyms that were on a direct route from Marcy's work to her home. He thought that she would rather sign up for a gym in this direction than at the opposite end of the city. He started calling various trailer parks. Several refused to even consider allowing RVs into their prime areas, but one was open and had a spot available. He arranged to move the motorhome in the morning. He would have to put blocks under the camper and come up with some kind of sheathing, but that was easy for someone as experienced as him. He also arranged for a telephone line and electricity. Water and sewerage were provided trailer park. He then called gyms looking for Mr. Cornings. He started with one that specialized in women-only memberships and found the right person from the first call. He made up an excuse by saying that a friend recommended Andy to him for personal training. Andy was called to the phone. Chuck gave a false name and relayed praise the fictitious friend allegedly said about the young man. Andy was so happy that someone thought so highly of him that he didn't even ask who recommended him. Chuck agreed to meet him at a bar a block from the gym after Andy finished his shift. Chuck then found the gym and parked so he could see the entrance. He didn't know if the employees had a separate entrance, but he didn't care. He was going to deal with Andy either at the bar or in the parking lot. He was just curious if Marcy had stopped by here on her way home from work. As he settled in for a potentially long wait, his pager suddenly beeped. He read the message and went to the pay phone outside to call Billy. His boss heard about an incident at the work site and just wanted to know how Chuck was doing. They talked for a while and Chuck returned to his car. He didn't have to wait long. Marcy was just leaving. Andy followed her. They stood and talked for a while. Marcy seemed upset and kept shaking her head. Chuck looked at his wife carefully. She seems to have lost weight. Perhaps the training, both physical and sexual, was bearing fruit. But she also looked sad and a little haggard. Marcy turned abruptly away from Mr. Cornings and headed toward her car. Andy turned and went back inside. His shift was supposed to end in 45 minutes. Chuck sincerely hoped that his meeting with Andy would interfere with Marcy's evening sex. Chuck waited and then followed Andy into the bar. As soon as he walked through the door, he saw Andy standing and looking around, trying to find his potential client. Chuck knew that Andy could be a formidable opponent since he was in excellent physical shape, so he decided to attack suddenly. Chuck walked up and hit Andy. He could have gone to jail for assault, but he didn't care. Chuck leaned close to the face of his wife's lover. "This is just a reminder to stop sleeping with married women, you bastard. Have sex with single women. If any married woman bothers you, tell her that you will be glad if your husband gives written permission, or she will break up with him before that. How do you sleep with her? Do you recognize me, asshole? You really need to find out who you're dealing with, dumbass. Other angry husbands might sneak up on you and beat you up. I'm Marcy's husband." A light came on in Andy's eyes. "She broke up with me. I won't see her anymore." "I'm guessing this just happened today, huh?" Andy nodded. "I'm guessing you slept with her for the last week while I was gone." Andy nodded again. "Did my daughter know you were with Marcy all last week?" Andy shrugged. "Listen carefully, motherfucker. The police will be here soon. I want you to tell them who beat you up. Tell them it's Marcy's husband and they'll find me. I want to go to jail because when I get out, I'll be more angrier at assholes like you. I will find you again and beat you. You will lie in a ditch, trying to breathe and cry in pain, and I will again tell you to leave married women alone." In the distance, Chuck heard a siren. Looks like someone finally called 911. He wasn't going to stay until the police arrived. They will have to try hard to find him. He also wanted the police to go to Marcy's place to find him. Maybe then she will think about her physical safety. Chuck then stood up and casually walked away a minute before the first police car arrived on the scene. He went back to his car outside and just sat there for a while and then drove away. He went to the other end of the city and found a pay phone. This may have been the last time he spoke to any of his family. He needed to know. He called Becky. She answered the second call. "Hey, Becky, I just wanted you to know that I stopped by the house and picked up some clothes. I'm not going back there. Tell your mother to get her boyfriend to do the yard. It's the least he can do, since he gets sex for free." "Dad, she doesn't see him. It was all a big mistake. She never cheated on you." "Shut up and listen. I just talked to Mr. Cornings. He admitted to sleeping with her at her house for the past week. Now I know you knew about it. All I want is honesty. You knew what is she was cheating on before the anniversary party." "Dad, no, he wasn't there. I know it looks bad, but he wasn't there. Just ask Mom, she'll tell you. It's all a mistake. She's been crying all week." "Becky, you are my daughter, and I love you. I will always love you, but I don't like you right now. She's cheating, and you're a liar for her sake. I hope you can live with this decision to protect her." "Daddy, please." "No, don't hang up. Mommy loves you." "Yeah, just like when I was in high school. She loved me enough to accept another guy's prom invitation while she was dating me. It was my prom. She had 2 more proms ahead, but she couldn't wait until I left for college. She just wanted everything at once and with others too, and she lost friends for a whole year by deceiving me. Now she is again. Proves his love for me by having an affair with some bastard to get pleasure. Not once did she try to talk to me about it. Not once did I get any hint of what she wanted from our relationship. I worked, I built for her, I did everything to make her happy, but Andy had to sit at the head of the table on our anniversary." Becky cried into the phone. "Please, Dad, it's not that bad. Please understand, Mom." Something alarming stirred in Chuck's mind. Becky continued to beg. "Please come home so Mom can explain. You can get over this and be happy again. You should see it from her side before you make rash decisions." The anxiety grew stronger. He remained silent, allowing Becky to continue speaking through her tears. "You have to understand it from a woman's point of view. Mom will be able to explain what really happened, and she wants to do it." She was unsatisfied. It exploded in his mind like a grenade. "You knew, didn't you? Moreover, ever since you came home from college, you've been promoting nonsense about how women have been oppressed for so long and should now become oppressors. You advised your mother to take a lover, didn't you? You trash. How can you say you love me when you're stabbing me in the back?" Becky started crying even harder. She didn't deny it. "I raised you. I carried you when you were too tired to walk. I carried you on my shoulders so you could see the parades. I changed your diapers when you were a baby. I attended all your events, even when you were too busy or too tired to think. I bought you a car and I pay for your education. And this is how you repay my love, by advising your mother to have a lover. Don't talk to your father, don't try to explain your desires, just go and cheat. Behind my back, behind my back. You were never supposed to find out about this. We didn't mean to hurt you. It was never supposed to go like this. Yes, of course. Everyone will find out sooner or later. Luckily, everyone found out before I became the laughing stock of the whole town. Once I found out, I had to beat up one of my employees today to get the whole crew back to work. Your feminist bullshit never considers the consequences. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, me and your mom against the world, with you on our side against everyone who tries to tear us apart. But no, your bullshit doesn't stink, so you think I'll just swallow it and let it. You play me like a fool, not a bit of concern for my self-respect, about my manhood, only your female pleasures are important. To hell with the rest of what is needed for a relationship." Becky tried to interrupt his angry speech. "Please, Dad, listen." "No, no. You listen to me. I hope you fall madly in love with some guy, and he will lead home cheap prostitutes to do it right in front of you, telling you that you are not good enough to satisfy him. Then maybe you will understand what you and your mother did to me. I hope, God, I hope. Chuck hung up. He couldn't go on any longer. Tears of despair, grief from the loss of his daughter, tears of sadness from a broken family, and simply tears of self-pity, which he had a right to, flowed down his face. People passing by looked at his face with concern, but did not stop to find out why he was so upset. His thoughts were spinning so wildly in his head that he could have simply walked out onto the roadway if some guy hadn't grabbed him and turned him back to the sidewalk. The Good Samaritan almost got punched for his efforts, but his "hey, hey, hey" cut through the fog in Chuck's head. Chuck grabbed his savior's hands in gratitude. He nodded, unable to speak, and then let go. He sat down on the sidewalk and let his grief pour out. After a few minutes, he began to gain control and look around. He fought the urge to slip back into an alcoholic stupor and perhaps never return. He needed to forget himself for just a moment. Suddenly, he could understand every person who was addicted to alcohol. Just forgetting himself for a few minutes would be a great relief, but he knew from his experience just a week ago that it wouldn't work. God, it's only been a week and a half since that disastrous anniversary party. It seemed like a lifetime had passed. Every day was full of crap. A patrol policeman approached him and inquired about his condition. Chuck assured him that everything would be fine. When the policeman asked if he had been drinking, Chuck had to laugh. "No, buddy, thank God. That would be 10 times worse. My marriage is dead and my daughter helped kill it. That's the whole story. I'm single and will be for a while." He stood up from the sidewalk and brushed off his butt. Chuck looked the cop straight in the eyes. "Yes, everything will be fine, but it will take time." He shook the policeman's hand and headed to his car. He was surprised he wasn't arrested for attacking Andy, but he shrugged. They will find him sooner or later. He wasn't going anywhere. He bought a bottle of bourbon on the way to the camper, but only intended to stare at the amber color as he slowly slipped his only drink of the night. The next morning, he came to work early to get things done before finding a good divorce lawyer. He asked various employees for their opinions on lawyers and found a couple of possibilities. Curiously, even the women did not try to persuade him to forgive and return home. Apparently, his mental wound was more obvious than he thought. He contacted lawyers and made appointments to discuss his cases. The first lawyer was a bit strange and full of ideas about equal division of assets. Chuck wasn't impressed. Marcy deserved something, but not half, not after what she did. He went to the second lawyer and found the shark. This was a woman lawyer who was deceived by her ex-husband, another lawyer. Through backroom deals with the judge, he took almost everything from her, even though he was the one caught red-handed. Chuck told her the whole story without leaving out his own shortcomings in sensitivity and sex education. When he got to the point where Marcy announced her affair in front of all the guests, she slammed the table. "Now we have it on her. We will take statements from everyone present. The judge will not be kind to the way you were humiliated in front of the people important to you." There were similar exclamations when Chuck recounted how he had to beat up Butch to get the crew to work again. More examples of your wife kicking you in the teeth. The final nail in the interview was when Chuck told Julie, his lawyer, about how Becky helped her mother. "What a stupid bitch. We women shouldn't become equal by putting men down. We become equal by proving ourselves equal, not better. It just takes time and effort. Hell, a few years ago, a woman had no chance of becoming a partner in a law firm, but now we women are becoming partners faster than men." They discussed the division of assets. Overall, Chuck wanted the bulk of his savings and investments. In exchange, Marcy had to keep the house. After all, Chuck built it for her, and it was her overall design. Chuck continued to pay Becky's tuition since she was accepted into medical school, another place where being a woman helped. Previously, the ratio of men to women in schools was disproportionate, but now schools are actively recruiting women, especially minorities. Becky was not a minority, so she had to beat out some minorities, but she beat out some very qualified men. There were other requirements that Julie considered not problematic for the divorce. One of them was that Chuck would not have to attend meetings where Marcy or Becky would be. Marcy was served with a summons at her place of work. Julie thought it was appropriate since her colleagues were attending the anniversary party. The message was clear: don't touch Chuck or there will be consequences. The official wording was about treason, but the documents also mentioned public humiliation and disrespect. At the same time, Marcy's colleagues were subpoenaed to testify about what they knew about the affair and when they learned about it. Family members also received summonses, as did Billy and his wife. Julie told Chuck that Marcy burst into tears in front of her boss and co-workers when she read the documents. She apparently never imagined that Chuck might file for divorce. Since neither Becky nor her mother knew Chuck's new address or phone number, they tried to contact him through work. They failed. Billy gave strict instructions to the secretary not to miss calls from them. Marcy managed to get through to Chuck one time when she lied and said she was a client. The conversation was short. Chuck hung up abruptly. Julie reported that Marcy and Becky came to the first meeting. They had several counter demands, but Marcy burst into tears when she was offered paperwork to change her last name from Newmayer to Baines. Becky was also very upset when she was offered paperwork to change her last name from Newmayer to Baines. Chuck was afraid that Becky would refuse to change her last name, but he wanted her to understand the consequences of her actions. She was no longer his daughter in his eyes. In the weeks that followed, Marcy found a lawyer who immediately filed a motion for family counseling and also wanted to change the division of assets. He even tried to prove moral damages, since Chuck left without warning and did not speak to his wife. Julie laughed at this statement. If the case goes to trial, Marcy's lawyer could be reprimanded by the judge. The first trial was the first time Chuck was in the same room as Marcy or Becky after the anniversary party. Several months have passed. Becky was supposed to be in class, but got permission to support her mother. The judge asked questions to each of the participants. He understood that Marcy was trying to fight the divorce. Her lawyer called her to the stand to tell her side of the story. She said she was so happy about the anniversary that she started drinking early in the morning, which she had never done before, and that by that evening she was drunk. Judge, I'm ashamed to say that I was almost unconscious from drunkenness. Why anyone stayed and put up with me, I can't understand. But all of our friends and family stayed. I honestly don't remember what I said when I got up to talk to everyone. I think I passed out right after that. When asked about the affair, Marcy denied it. She stated that any words she might have uttered were simply the words of a drunk person. She loved Chuck and was completely destroyed by him, leaving a 25-year marriage because of the ravings of a drunk woman. It was Julie's turn to ask questions. She started with the alleged affair. Marcy denied it again and said Chuck must have had a nervous breakdown if he believed she was having an affair. Julie smiled at Marcy and asked if she understood the penalty for perjury. Marcy looked at her lawyer, then nodded. Julie motioned her assistant to the doors of the hall. The door opened and Andy Cornings walked in and sat down in the back row. Enough time has passed for any wounds on his face to heal, but his nose definitely didn't look the same. It was still twisted and seemed to be giving him trouble breathing. Julie turned back to Marcy. Marcy looked defeated. Mrs. Newmeyer, I will ask you again about your alleged affair with personal trainer Andy Cornings. Did you actually have an affair that began before your anniversary party and continued after until your husband returned to town? If you do not answer truthfully, I will call Mr. Cornings to the podium. Marcy lowered her head and nodded. For the record, Julie said, record that Mrs. Newmeyer nodded her head in agreement with the question. The judge took the floor. Mrs. Newmeyer, I would like to know why you started an affair and why did you try to hide it from everyone when it is already known? I read the statements of the party participants, and they all agree that you declared that your husband could not satisfy you and that Mr. Ginning Cornings should have been at the head of the table instead of your husband. Somehow you believe you have the right to break your marriage vows without consequences, and your lawyer seems determined to punish your husband, who has done nothing but be a good husband and father. He stopped and looked over his glasses. If I could, I would have you locked up for attempted perjury and kicked out of my courtroom, but I can't do that. He looked at Marcy's lawyer. Given the guilty plea regarding the affair, do you want to amend your counter-motion? The lawyer nodded. Chuck theorized that Marcy was spinning her own web of excuses and tricking him into believing her version of events. The judge cleared his throat and ordered Marcy to return to the table next to Becky and the lawyer. Julie smiled at Chuck and whispered, "I think we win. As far as I don't know, he may still order counseling." The judge addressed Chuck directly. "Sir, I understand that your wife has hurt you badly, but worse things have happened in marriages, and they have survived. Do you see any path to forgiveness? I am seriously considering marriage counseling." Chuck stood up. "Your Honor, I have also tried to find a way to forgive, but this is not the first time my wife has done something like this. The first time was when we dated in school. Since we grew up together, and since I am a couple older than her, I was always assigned as her protector and friend in elementary school. We started dating in middle school and continued dating in high school. We were not sexually intimate as it was not accepted at that time, but planned to give each other our virginity after my prom. A few weeks before graduation, Marcy announced that she was going with someone else. As far as I knew, she was also going to give her most personal asset to this other person instead of me, the person she supposedly loved, and expected that we would meet on other occasions. She wanted everything at once to date me, but do what she wanted with others, and she expected that I would accept this. Since she was several years younger than me at school, she would have had other opportunities to go to prom, but because of her greed and self-centeredness, she decided that she wanted this prom too. Chuck stopped to catch his breath. We didn't date for 2 years while I was in junior college and only came home for the holidays. I refused to be in the same room as her on most visits, even though our families were great friends and neighbors. When I returned after college, I decided that she had probably matured, and we started dating again and then got married. During all these years, she never expressed her disappointment in our sexual interactions. I will say this again. There was never a time when she expressed disappointment in mine, sexual skills or lack of knowledge. I had no idea what she was feeling until that night, when I think alcohol allowed her to finally express her contempt for me, and, because I satisfied her, she felt entitled to seek sexual satisfaction in the arms and bed of another man. I later learned that this feeling of entitlement was a direct result of conversations with my ex-daughter, Rebecca Newmeyer, who encouraged Marcy's behavior and believed that I would never know. I also believe that they both sincerely believed that if I found out, I would remain silent and let it continue unimpeded. He stopped and looked at Marcy and Rebecca. He could no longer call her Becky, since she was a stranger to him. Your Honor, I believe that a lack of trust in my ability to accept criticism about my shortcomings, a lack of faith that I will try to change, and a lack of respect from my wife and my estranged daughter make it impossible for me to consider forgiveness now or in the future. I can't even think about being in the same room as them, except that I had to be there today to give my side of the story. As soon as your gavel hits, I'll be the first to leave the room, sir." The judge nodded. "I understand, sir. I have sat in this place for many years. I have had both hurt husbands and wives stand before me. Some were able to restore their marriages, but most were destroyed by the thoughtless actions of their spouses. I am also very sad that this happened for the sake of all of you." He stopped and looked at the documents. "I see that you, Mr. Newmeyer, are asking that your wife revert to her maiden name. She has not signed the papers, and I cannot order it. I also notice that you are asking your daughter to legally change her last name to Baines, which was your wife's maiden name. Since you explained, I now understand why you made this request. Again, I can't legally force someone to change their name. Sometimes I wish I could. Your lawyer will also advise you to change your will and make sure that all life insurance policies have different beneficiaries. Since you cannot change their names, you can make sure that they do not benefit from your death." He leafed through the papers again. "I see no reason to delay this. Despite your wishes, Mrs. Newmeyer, I am granting your husband's request for a divorce. Unless he files another petition 120 days from today, this divorce will become final. I am granting his division of assets. I'm sure the house has appreciated significantly since it was built, so you can sell it for a profit at any time. I see no reason why you should benefit from your mistake. Despite what your lawyer says, I advise you to choose wisely next time. Once, or you'll end up in court again. He looked at Rebecca. You haven't said a word today, but I hope you can understand what started when you encouraged your mother to break her marriage vows. The fact that you both didn't respect Mr. Newmayer and didn't try to communicate your wants and needs is concerning. I cannot legislate from this place, so the only ones who will suffer are you. You must live with the consequences of your actions, so I advise you both to stop next time and take a deep breath before you make such decisions. Do better next time. His hammer struck, and Chuck soon became a free man. He actually left the room first. He had no intention of ever speaking to any of them again. He also had an appointment to continue studying with his favorite teachers. This was already the fourth training meeting. He didn't know what the theme would be this time, but each previous one had been a discovery and an education. Several classes were too difficult for his liking, but he made an effort to understand their goals. Marcy began dating and eventually remarried. The marriage did not last more than 2 years, as the new husband could no longer tolerate being compared to his first husband. Somehow Chuck became a saint and couldn't do anything wrong, even though Marcy's new husband gave her plenty during sex. She began to stalk Chuck, although the term stalking was not yet popular. She kept an eye on him and tried to intercept him in random situations. It worked in the end, didn't it? She even threatened several of Chuck's girlfriends, with limited success. Although his girlfriend might decide to leave, Chuck had no intention of returning to Marcy again. He loved her and was in love with her, but he didn't love her anymore, and that was an obstacle she couldn't overcome. Rebecca used her father's money to complete her education. She then put aside the same amount and tried to return it to him. He remained firm in his desire not to acknowledge her again. She eventually started a foundation to help with marriage counseling and became a strong advocate for counseling. Chuck's prayer and wish came true for Rebecca. She met another doctor in medical school, and they married soon after. She thought they had as good a marriage as her parents had before their anniversary. Apparently, that was the case. One day, her husband came home and brought a nurse with him. He told Rebecca to leave and closed the door behind her when she did not want to leave voluntarily. Oh yes, Mr. Andy Cornings. Looks like he didn't learn his lesson the first time. He used his crooked and depraved nose to attract even more women. He finally learned his lesson when his next girlfriend's husband came home early and found Mr. Personal Trainer showing his wife new sexual positions as a workout. The husband went to prison, but Mr. Cornings had to learn to live with a catheter because his dignity was damaged in the fight. Some will say that this is a well-deserved punishment. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.